It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most quietly horrifying landscapes of modern history. The trenches of the First World War. Yes, you've heard about them, but not like this. We're going to talk about the rats, the rot, and the poetry, the strange friendships, the tin mugs of tea, and the absurdity of dying face down in 6 inches of French mud. This isn't a lecture, it's a slow, muddy descent into a place where time stopped making sense, and where human dignity somehow clung to the sandbags anyway. So if you're here to fall asleep, or to feel less alone tonight, stay a while. Maybe tell me where you're listening from, or what time it is, or don't. Just know I'm glad you made it. Dim the lights, and let's drift back in time. They didn't know what was coming. Not really. Not the grocers in Ghent, arranging apples like little sons on wooden carts. Not the boys in Bavaria, racing bicycles past stone chapels and old women with aprons full of gooseberries. Not the ladies of Norwich, tightening their corsets with a sigh and wondering, quietly, why the world was getting faster. Not the men polishing boots in train stations, or the bakers turning out crusty loaves before dawn, or the farmers who leaned on their spades and talked to the sky like it was an old friend. It was the summer of 1914, the last summer, some called it afterward, but at the time it was just a warm, complicated season like any other. Europe was beautiful, not in the clean way that postcards pretend, but in the deeply lived-in way of smoke-stained bricks. Moss on wells, copper pots in messy kitchens. Cows ruled the roads in Belgium. The clatter of carriages still outnumbered the roar of automobiles. And in the parks of Vienna, old men played chess under chestnut trees, while children fished for tadpoles with bits of string. The pace of life was changing but gently. Electric lights were spreading, but slowly. Trains crossed countries now, but telephones still startled people when they rang. You could feel modernity brushing its fingertips against the edges of old things, like a boy too shy to kiss someone he loved. It was a world full of soft tensions. France remembered defeat. Germany remembered ambition. Britain balanced its tea on top of a crumbling empire. Russia was brooding and vast, like a story with no proper ending, and Austria-Hungary was many things, all held together by a mustache and a prayer. But ordinary people weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about prices, about aching backs, about the girl at the bakery with the dimple in her cheek, about whether the winter would be bad this year, and whether the rent could be paid before the landlord came knocking. In the cities, people talked politics, but mostly the way people talk, whether a little too warm for June, a little too tense in Sarajevo, and when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in an open car beside his wife by a teenage revolutionary with a pistol and a death wish, the world held its breath, then exhaled, because surely it would pass. Surely it was just another assassination in a century full of them. But telegrams began to fly, and men in brass buttons began to frown at maps, and treaties began to wake up from their long, useless slumber. The engine of history, so slow and sleepy just days before, roared to life like a monster coming out of hibernation, and within weeks, train stations were full of uniforms. Young men who had never left their villages, now kissing mothers goodbye, not knowing that they were walking toward trenches, toward lice and gas and poems scrawled in pencil on scraps of ration boxes. But here, just before all that, there was still the smell of bread in the morning, still time to kiss someone in the doorway, still time to believe the world was, more or less, ordinary. For the last time, they marched off laughing. That part's not a myth. Photographs from the summer of 1914 show boys in wide-brimmed hats and awkward grins, posing with mothers who looked like they'd forgotten how to breathe. Whole towns turned out to wave them off. Bunting, brass bands, small children clapping with sticky hands. In the cities, ladies leaned out of windows with handkerchiefs. In the countryside, people walked for miles just to watch the trains go. And the boys, they were boys. Most of them kept saying it. We'll be home by Christmas. As if war were a brief, inconvenient detour in the great journey toward adulthood. The newspapers helped. They printed cartoons of mustachioed enemies who would be crushed in weeks. They promised victories, medals, parades. They called it a noble fight, a just war, the war to end all wars before it had even begun. Recruitment posters shouted from every alley. A finger pointed straight at you. A lion stood over a fallen foe. A girl smiled in a nurse's cap, as if to say, "Come back heroic, and I'll be waiting." Even the doubters felt swept up. The mood was too large, too loud. In pubs, in churches, in schoolyards, people spoke as if the war had already happened, and they had already won. And for the ones who enlisted, there was a strange pride in becoming something. No longer a clerk, no longer a farmhand, no longer a second son stuck in his brother's shadow. Now they were soldiers. Now they had uniforms. Now they belonged. Some carried cigarettes, some carried lockets, some carried Bibles, or the memory of a good kiss in a dark corner of a train station. But none of them carried a true picture of what was waiting, because nobody told them about the mud. Nobody told them that the trains would stop just short of hell, that they would dig with frozen fingers for days, weeks, sing till the world became a long, stinking ditch lined with rotting boards and dead dreams, that they would live in trenches carved like scars into the countryside, where the water rose to their ankles and never left. That war was less about courage and more about waiting. But they didn't know yet. Not the boy who kissed his mother's hand at the station. Not the friends who linked arms and sang as the train pulled away. Not the fathers who lit pipes and said, "He'll make us proud." Not the girls who watched until the smoke disappeared into the hills. And not the men who stayed behind, too old, too sick, too sensible. They watched the boys go and said nothing, because sometimes there's no way to stop a river once it breaks its banks. Sometimes the world decides to go mad, and the best you can do is pack a tin of biscuits and hope someone remembers your name. They didn't know how to prepare. Not really. There hadn't been a proper European war in a long time, at least not one like this. There had been skirmishes, colonial campaigns, brave little deaths in deserts. But Europe had been playing a slow game of chess under candlelight for decades. Generals grew old in velvet chairs. Officers polished medals they'd earned chasing shadows across Africa. Tactics had not kept up with the weapons. So when the war began, they reached for old books. Books with horses on the cover. Books that talked about honor and glory and fixed bayonets. Books that had never heard of machine guns. Instructions were printed. March in formation. Dig shallow trenches. Keep your boots dry and your chin up. There were rules for how to write a letter home, but not for what to say after your best friend bled out in your lap. There were manuals for cleaning rifles, but none for how to clean fear from your bones. Some armies brought cavalry, real cavalry, horses with feathered headpieces and riders with sabers shining like wedding silver. They looked magnificent. They lasted about a week. Artillery changed the air. It wasn't a boom, it was a scream that never ended. Shells that tore through earth like angry gods. Shells that buried men alive. Shells that left behind craters big enough to swallow trucks and faith alike. And the gas, no one had prepared for gas. The manuals hadn't imagined a green cloud crawling low across the battlefield. Hadn't imagined the way lungs would blister from the inside. How men would claw at their own throats, eyes wide, mouths frothing, trying to breathe in a world that no longer had oxygen for them. The masks came later. At first, they tied handkerchiefs soaked in urine across their faces. It helped, a little, but only if you knew it was coming. Only if the wind didn't change. Only if you weren't sleeping, which many were, because sleep, somehow, still came. Even here, in this strange new world of sandbags and blood, the body still collapsed into dreams when it could. Sometimes, men dreamed of fields, of bread, of women's voices, and sometimes, they didn't dream at all. They just lay there, open-eyed, pretending the stars were back home. Command kept writing new instructions, new ways to dig, new formations to try, new words for failure. But the soldiers, they learned something else. That this war was not about strategy or skill. It was about surviving long enough to see the sky again. It was about finding small ways to stay human in a place designed to erase you. A cup of tea, a song, a shared cigarette, tiny rebellions in a world gone mad. Because the manuals never mentioned how loud the silence could be after a shell falls, or how wet death feels when it slips into your socks, or how sometimes the only thing keeping you sane is the rat who sleeps beside you every night. There is mud, and then there is trench mud. Not the kind that clings to boots after a rainy walk. Not the kind that smells of earth and spring. Trench mud was something else. A hybrid, a horror, a living thing, made of water, blood, excrement, rot, and whatever God had turned his face away when the first shell fell. It swallowed feet, it swallowed bodies, it could rise past the ankles in minutes, and it stayed cold even in summer. In winter, it froze around your legs like a promise you couldn't break. Men grew to hate it more than the enemy, because the enemy could miss. The mud never did. It came through the walls, through the floor, through the blankets. It crept into the seams of clothing, into the pages of letters from home. It laughed at boots. It chewed through socks. It left skin grey, bloated, puckered like raw meat left too long in water. They called it trench foot. It started as numbness, then pain. Then, if you were lucky, it stopped feeling anything at all. The flesh turned soft, then purple, then black. Toes dropped off like bruised fruit. And still, you had to march. Still, you had to stand to attention while the officer read the names of the dead. Some men tried to dry their feet by lighting scraps of newspaper beneath them. Some shared grease. Some took off their socks, wrung them out, and put them back on because there was nothing else. Some just stopped trying. The medical tents were overwhelmed. The nurses did what they could. But what could you really do for a man who had been standing in corpses and rainwater for 3 weeks? Mud was everywhere. It filled the bottom of the trench, yes, but also the cracks in the sole. It made everyone slower, colder, meaner. It stole your shoes and your sense of humor. It made the stars disappear. And after enough time, it made you forget there had ever been a world without it. Because there is something about constant dampness that breaks a man. Not suddenly, but slowly. A slow leak in the spirit. A quiet kind of drowning. And the smell. It wasn't just mud. It was mud married to decay. Rotting sandbags. Corpses unearthed by the last shell. A dead mule just beyond the parapet, bloating in the sun. A fellow soldier's intestines, half buried, now indistinguishable from tree roots. There were moments, brief, treacherous moments, when a man would stand still, waist deep in the ooze, and think, I could just let go, just stop fighting, sink like a coin into dark water. But something always pulled them back. A letter, a joke, a memory, the sound of boots squelching behind them. Someone still alive. It wasn't honor that kept them going. Not really. It was something quieter. The terrible, stubborn belief that someday this mud would dry. That someday there would be grass again, and children, and shoes that didn't bleed when you took them off. You could hear them before you saw them. At night, when the guns fell silent, if they ever did, you could hear the soft rustling first. A sound like newspapers shifting in a draft. Then the wet plop of something moving through water. Then the high, strange squeals of creatures who had grown far too confident. They were not normal rats. They were enormous, fat on flesh and bold from boredom. Some grew larger than cats, it was said, but no one laughed when they said it. They weren't afraid of humans. Why would they be? Humans fed them. Every day, new bodies appeared in the trenches, in the craters, in the wire, sometimes whole, sometimes not. The rats came for the eyes first. They always did. Soft tissue, easy to reach. Then the cheeks, the lips, sometimes the genitals. Soldiers would wake to find one gnawing at a sleeping friend, or worse, at their own butt already halfway to the skin beneath. They tried everything, kicking, shooting, poison, but there were too many, and for every one killed, 10 more would come. Born in the belly of the trench, raised on death, thoroughly unbothered by bullets or boots. Some soldiers began to name them, gave them little ranks. That one was General Whiskers, the one missing an ear, Corporal Bastard. Humor helped, just barely. One man wrote home that he'd seen 2 rats fighting over a severed hand, and suddenly realized he wasn't afraid of dying anymore, just of being left behind. The officers said not to talk like that, but the officers didn't sleep where the rats did, didn't wake to the sound of scratching beneath their coats, didn't find tiny teeth marks in their last chocolate ration. It changed you, living beside rats, worse, living beneath their judgment, because sometimes it felt like they were watching, waiting, like they knew who was too weak to stand much longer. There's a kind of madness that comes from being prey, not to lions, not to bears, but to vermin. Small, laughing vermin with red eyes, and to many children. Sometimes they were shot just for being there. Sometimes men whispered to them, asked them to leave a friend alone, begged them to wait until morning. Because when your world becomes so small, just a ditch, a rifle, and the cold, everything else starts to feel too large, even rats. And when you live in death long enough, you start to envy whatever thrives in it. They said the rats always ran first when gas was coming. They knew, they always knew. And if you saw them scurry all at once, like a tide, you didn't wait. You put your mask on, you prayed, if you remembered how, and you hoped you were faster than a rat. The trench was not a place, it was a sentence, carved into the landscape like a wound that wouldn't close. Not straight lines, those were a fantasy. They zigzagged, bent and buckled to avoid offering a clean shot to snipers, like veins on a dying hand, stretching across France, Belgium, memory. They were built by hands that should have held books, tools, lovers. Instead, those hands gripped shovels. 10 hours a day, in rain, in sleet, in silence. The top was for the brave or the stupid. The rest lived below, In mud-packed corridors, no wider than a man's shoulders, walls of dirt and woven branches, boards laid underfoot to stop you from sinking completely. But they didn't work. Not really. There were names for each part. Front line, support, reserve. Sap trenches, where men tunneled forward like termites. Listening posts, where they pressed their ears to the soil and tried to guess if death was coming underground. Because sometimes it was. Sometimes the enemy was beneath you, mining, listening, waiting for the right moment to blow the earth up from under your feet. But mostly, it was above artillery, snipers, shrapnel, the kind of danger you didn't see, only heard, and then didn't hear at all. The trench smelled of rot, smoke, rust, and something else. Something living and dying at once. Sweat and fear and whatever was left when dignity went out with the morning piss tin. Men relieved themselves in tin cans, slept beside the place they pissed, ate next to the place they bled. Privacy didn't exist. Shame was a luxury. And yet they wrote letters home, tried to keep their socks dry, talked about football, shared whatever cigarettes hadn't been crushed by the mud. Sometimes a man would sing, quietly, to himself. A lullaby he didn't remember learning. Something about home. Something with a window and a warm plate. It wasn't a life, but it was living, just barely. Mail came, sometimes wrapped in oilskin, to keep out the wet. A few pages from someone you used to be, back when you had a first name instead of a serial number. They read them slow, over and over, until the paper softened like cloth, until the voice on the page felt like it might reach through the dirt and hold your face in its hands. The trench was a grave you learned to decorate, a coffin you swept each morning with the toe of your boot, not because it helped, but because you needed to believe it might. And always, above just a few feet up, was the world, a sky full of birds who didn't know this was a war, a breeze that smelled of wheat fields, a sun that didn't care. Men grew old in that space between sky and soil, old before they had a chance to be young, because the trench didn't just take your health, it took your memory of what life had been and replaced it with the knowledge of how easily a man can disappear. You'd be surprised what matters once everything else is gone. Tea, for instance. It wasn't good tea. It was strong, black, boiled over a fire made from bits of crate and luck. But it was warm, and warm meant something. They drank it in tin mugs, their hands shaking from cold or fear or both. The mugs dented and blackened, often passed down from one man to another, like holy relics in a church of filth and fatigue. It wasn't the taste they needed, it was the pause, the ceremony, the moment to pretend that life still had room for small, useless comforts. Cigarettes were another altar, passed between cracked lips, lit from matches hidden in wax paper or stolen from dead pockets. One drag, two drags, then passed down the line, shared like secrets, inhaled like memory. Some men carved little animals from bits of wood. Others wrote poems, crude, lovely things scribbled in notebooks stained with grease and mud. One man carved a chess set from bullets. Another kept a diary hidden in the lining of his coat. A third recited Shakespeare to the rats. No one thought it was strange, because strange had long since lost its meaning. There were games, too, cards played on overturned helmets, wagers made with buttons and jam rations. Anything to pretend that time still existed. They celebrated birthdays when they remembered, lit candles in empty tins, sang off-key. One group baked a tiny cake from army biscuit crumbs and condensed milk, It took 3 weeks to save the ingredients. It was gone in 3 bites. But for those 3 bites, they were somewhere else. Clean shirts were rare, but when they arrived, men wept. Not dramatically, just a quiet, shivering gratitude. Because something clean against the skin felt like forgiveness. Letters were read aloud, even the dull ones, especially the dull ones. Because news about cows and leaky roofs meant the world was still turning somewhere. And when someone cried because they did, though rarely in front of others, no one mocked them, not really, they just looked away. Let the moment pass, offered a cigarette, because kindness in the trench was like gold leaf on a corpse, pointless, maybe, but still beautiful. They patched each other's clothes, shared socks, killed lice for each other. One man kept a photograph of his dog wrapped in oilskin. He showed it to every new soldier who joined their section. "This is Charlie," he said, and every time they nodded, because sometimes pretending to care about a stranger's dog was the only thing holding the world together. There was no meaning, not in the larger sense. The war made sure of that. But there was ritual, and in ritual, a kind of resistance. A refusal to let death have everything. Because if you can still make tea in hell, you're not entirely lost. Noise was constant until it wasn't. You might think the worst part of trench warfare was the shelling, and you wouldn't be wrong, but it was the silence that stayed with men. The wrong kind of silence, heavy, suspicious, a silence that felt like the whole world had ducked beneath the table and left you standing alone. The shells came in waves, whistles first, then howls. Then the ground would actually leap like it was trying to shrug the war off its back. Dirt flew like birds, and then impact. Your ribs felt it more than your ears, your teeth too. They ached after a day of shelling, like they'd been rattled in your skull too long. And when the shelling stopped, that's when it got worse. Because in the absence of noise, something primitive awoke. A voice in the back of the brain that whispered, "Something's wrong. This is not peace. This is bait." They called it the listening silence. No birds, no breeze, no breath. Just a tightness in the air. Like the world itself was holding still, afraid to make a sound. Sometimes the silence meant gas. Sometimes a raid. Sometimes nothing. But it never felt empty, it felt expectant. And in those moments, men would freeze. Mid-step, mid-bite, mid-joke. The entire trench would go still, as if someone had pressed pause. You could hear your heartbeat, hear someone else's boots shift 2 yards away, hear a match strike, hear a man mutter a prayer he hadn't said in 10 years. That silence aged people. Made them older in minutes, made them remember things they'd forgotten just to stay sane. The curve of a road near home, the weight of snow on a tin roof, the name of a girl they never kissed, but always meant to. And then a flare, a shot, a scream, and the world started again, like a film projector stuttering back to life, but the silence lingered, even in the noise. It clung to the backs of their throats. It echoed behind every bang. It reminded them, always, that quiet didn't mean safety, only absence. And absence could be worse. Because a man who's afraid of noise can duck. But a man who's afraid of nothing at all, he doesn't know where to run. And so they stayed still, lit their cigarettes with shaking hands, drank their tea when it was still warm, waited for the next sound, because it always came. War never forgot to knock again. It didn't smell like mustard. It smelled wrong, sweet, almost like rotting fruit, like a lie pretending to be a perfume. The first time it rolled in, men didn't even run, just blinked, coughed, tilted their heads like dogs hearing something strange. By the time they understood, it was already inside them. Mustard gas wasn't fire. It wasn't thunder. It was betrayal in a breeze. It didn't kill right away. It lingered, curled around the ankles, waited for skin to sweat, waited for lungs to open. Then it got to work. Eyes first swollen, blind, skin next blisters like wet leaves stuck to every inch of flesh. Then the lungs, oh, the lungs. It filled them with liquid, a slow drowning from the inside out. Not water, not blood, something thicker, something green, something that made men gag until they forgot what air had once felt like. There were masks, eventually, heavy things, rubbery, full of sweat and fogged glass. They worked, if you had one. If you didn't, you tied a sock around your mouth and prayed. But even the masks had rules. You couldn't take them off. Not for tea, not to shout, not even to vomit. Some men tore them off anyway. Better to breathe and die than suffocate and survive. There were stories of men going mad, not because of pain, because of silence. One lay still for hours, blinded, thinking he was dead. When his friends found him, he was humming. They said gas dreams were different, that when you passed out from it, your dreams turned yellow, that everything smelled like sugar and metal, that you could see people you'd lost, haven people you hadn't met yet. One man swore he saw his unborn son. Another said he saw God, but God was crying. The doctors tried saline, bandages, morphine when they could spare it, but there were too many. And mustard gas didn't just wound, it marked. Men came back from it, twisted, scarred. Their lungs never the same. Their skin never smooth. Their voices like gravel being poured into tin buckets. Some were called cowards when they didn't want to go back. Shell-shocked, they whispered. Soft, but they weren't soft. They were broken open by something invisible. Something that crept beneath the ribs and planted a scream. And then, after all that, the gas would clear, the air would return, and the birds somehow would come back, as if nothing had happened. But the men would wake up wrong, eyes red, skin burning, breathing like every inhale cost them something. They'd light a cigarette, if they could, because tobacco still tasted like the past, still reminded them of when smoke wasn't trying to kill them, and they'd go back to the trench, because what else was there? In this war, the only thing worse than staying was going home too soon. It wasn't always horror. That's the part people forget. It wasn't always screaming and crying and gasping. Sometimes, often, in fact, he was laughing. Stupid, loud, almost holy laughter that made no sense and saved everything. They laughed at the mud, at how it stole boots like a petty thief, at how a man could fall in and vanish, only to reappear with one sock and a frog in his helmet. They laughed at the lice, at the endless, crawling itch of being alive. One man trained his lice, named them, wrote them a song. Another staged a mock execution for his underpants, shouting, "Traitor, you've surrendered to filth." They laughed at their officers, at the posh accents, yelling nonsense from behind the lines. One sergeant wore a monocle stolen from a dead man and used it to inspect trench stew like a wine critic. They laughed at the Germans, called them names, made up rhymes, sometimes shouted insults across no man's land, followed by chocolate or tobacco, lobbed like gifts between tired gods. They laughed at themselves, too, at the absurdity of being 19 and writing a will, at the idea of dying before ever kissing someone without permission, at the letters from home asking if the weather was nice. But most of all, they laughed because they had to, because the alternative was a silence too heavy to carry. Because the human heart, for all its fragility, is deeply, stupidly defiant. And in the worst places, it throws a joke like a rope. One man carved a sign over his dugout. Chateau de misery, hot rats served daily. Another started a trench newspaper, full of fake headlines. New trench perfume launched. Eau de latrine. German soldier admits, I miss my mum. They played dead in the most theatrical ways. They wrote sonnets about sausages. They played football with human scolsius, really. Because when the ground itself is full of bones, sometimes you forget what's sacred. And they sang, badly, mostly, but often. Songs from home, songs with new lyrics about lice and mud and going bald from fear. Songs that made no sense, but made the trench feel smaller, more human. And when one of them died, because someone always did, they mourned, yes. But they also remembered the last joke he told. The punchline, the way he laughed so hard he spilled tea on his socks. That mattered. It mattered more than medals, more than strategy, more than some general's plans scratched out on a map far away from the screaming. Because in that place, where the world had forgotten its own face, laughter was a mirror, a way to say, I'm still here. I still know who I am. I still choose joy, even if it's cracked and filthy and smells like someone's feet. And when the day ended, and the stars blinked like they weren't watching, men wrapped themselves in damp blankets, lit the last cigarette, and whispered one more joke into the dark. Not because it was funny, but because it was defiance. They wrote with whatever they had. Stubs of pencil, ink stolen from officers, charcoal from the remains of a cooking fire. One man wrote with his finger in blood once. Just a line, just enough, because the words had to go somewhere. The army issued field stationery, thin paper, half-sized envelopes, and always the reminder, censored. Every letter read by someone with a red pen, scratching out the truth. No mention of locations. No mention of gas. No mention of Private Harris weeping after burying his brother in a crater full of water. So they learned to speak in code. I'm well meant. I haven't lost a limb this week. Rations are steady meant. We ate something warm, and no one died eating it. Morale is high meant. At least today, we're still joking. And yet, they tried to make it beautiful. They wrote about the sunrise, sometimes, the way it painted the mist pink over no man's land. They wrote about the larks that still sang, oblivious to barbed wire. About the stew, which somehow tasted of nothing and everything. They wrote about home, described dreams like postcards, asked about the dog, the garden, the street lamp that always flickered by the bakery, and sometimes they lied. Said they were warm, said they were safe, said we'll be back by Easter, even in December. Because truth is a burden, and love often means not handing it over. The letters came in sacks, dumped into trenches like blessings from another world. Men fought to find theirs, fingers black with mud tearing open soft white envelopes. They read slow, even the short ones, even the ones that said only, we're thinking of you, because those words carried warmth, because the paper still smelled faintly of home of soap, of coal dust, of lavender sachets tucked into drawers. They read them aloud sometimes, or folded them so small they could fit inside the corner of a pocket and still be touched during shell fire. Some men carried a single letter through the entire war, creased, unreadable, sacred. It didn't matter what it said. It mattered that it existed. It meant someone knew their name. And when they wrote back, they tried not to stain the paper with too much trench, tried to dry their hands, tried not to let the rain blur the words. Dear Mum, Dearest Ellie, my brother, you'd laugh if you saw me now. They signed them with hope, sometimes with love, sometimes just with initials because it hurt too much to say the whole name. And every time they sent one away, they watched it go as if watching a piece of themselves escape, carried by a tired man with a sack full of promises, headed toward a place where grass still grew and people still argued over dinner. They never knew if the letters made it, but they kept writing, because somewhere someone was waiting. And in a world made of mud and fear and rot, that wait was holy. They didn't fight in the trenches, they didn't wear khaki, but they knew the war just the same. The mothers in Liverpool, in Lyon, in Co, in farmhouses with crooked chimneys, and in apartments above the greengrocer, they waited, and waiting, as it turned out, was its own kind of war. They listened to the radio, they listened to the wind, they listened to the silence that sometimes stretched too long after asking, "Has anyone heard from him?" They held letters like lifelines, read them over bowls of cooling soup, folded them into coat pockets and touched them absent-mindedly, as if pressing the page could summon the sun. Some letters came once a week, some came once a season, some never came at all. They didn't cry much, not where others could see. Grief was a private thing, rationed like sugar. They kept busy, mended clothes, took in washing, wrote letters of their own, filled with cheerful lies. Your father's cough is better. The dog still waits at the gate. I made your favorite stew on Sunday. Everyone asked after you. Sometimes they sang. Lullabies meant for toddlers, repurposed for ghosts. Soft hums in kitchens, over loaves that wouldn't rise. Half-forgotten melodies held in trembling throats. They imagined him reading their words by candlelight. Imagined him laughing at the joke about the neighbor's pig. Imagined him warm, fed, safe. And when they heard a knock at the door, they froze. Because sometimes it was the postman, sometimes a friend, and sometimes it was the telegram boy. Those boys grew old too quickly. They rode bicycles, wore flat caps, held thin envelopes like they weighed 1,000 pounds. When a mother saw one walking up her path, she didn't breathe, didn't blink, just stood very still, as if motion might shift the balance of the universe. Deepest regrets. No one ever remembered the rest. The words blurred, the air changed, and somewhere a clock kept ticking, oblivious to the collapse. For some, the knock never came. For others, it came twice, and still they kept waiting, kept writing, kept saving chairs at the table. Because love doesn't stop for war, and grief doesn't wait for confirmation. It just moves in, puts its coat on the hook, and makes itself at home. But on quiet nights, when the wind was soft and the fire burned low, some mothers swore they could still hear the sound of small feet on the stairs, still feel the weight of a head on their shoulder, still hum the lullaby that never quite ended. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep breathing. There were love letters to pay. They didn't teach you how to write those in the barracks, but men wrote them anyway. Between shillings, between marches, with dirty fingers and stolen time. They wrote on the backs of ration slips, on the insides of cigarette cartons, on leaves once when paper ran out. They wrote not because they expected replies, but because saying I love you in ink felt like carving your name into the storm. A small defiance against erasure. Some wrote to girls back home, some to wives, some to boys no one could ever know about, to people they couldn't name, to people they barely knew, but remembered better than their own faces by now. My dearest Eleanor, if I don't come back, tell your mother I danced at least once. Remember when it rained in June and we kissed anyway? The war made poets of cowards, made philosophers of farmhands, made every man with a pencil a god for half a paragraph. And they folded those letters so carefully, tucked them into helmet linings, boots, breast pockets, close to the heart, always. Some never sent them, kept them close, like talismans. Read them before sleep, or what passed for sleep in a trench with mortar whispering lullabies overhead. Others sent everything, even the dumb ones, even the ones with misspelled words and ink stains, because somewhere, someone was waiting to read them, even if they didn't know it yet. And when a man died, as men so often did, another would go through his coat, find the letter, read it once, fold it again, and send it anyway. No return address, no explanation, just a quiet envelope, arriving like a ghost at the threshold of someone's grief. Sometimes the words weren't enough, so they drew hearts, faces, a tree with initials carved into the bark. One man sent a sketch of the moon and wrote beneath it, "This is what I see when I think of you." Some received letters soaked in perfume. Some sent pressed flowers stolen from shattered fields. Some just sent empty envelopes because the mail censors couldn't erase silence. And through all of it, love survived. Not the storybook kind, not the gallant charge into the night kind, but the kind that sits quietly beside fear and says, "I'm still here. I know who you are. I won't forget." Because in the great machinery of death, love was the only thing they didn't have a uniform for, didn't draft, didn't ration. And for some men, it was the only war they believed they might win. His name was Henry, or Thomas, or maybe just the lad. Names got slippery out there. Sometimes you only knew a man by the sound of his laugh, or the way he rolled his cigarettes, but everyone knew him because he sang. He wasn't good, not really. His voice cracked on the high notes, and sometimes he forgot the words halfway through, but he sang anyway. He sang in the mornings, when the fog still clung to the wires. He sang at dusk, when the rats emerged and the trench took on its nighttime breath. He sang during shelling, once, and no one dared to stop him. Mostly old songs, pub ballads, hymns, a lullaby his mother taught him, with a tune that rose and fell like a tired bird. He didn't sing for applause. There was none. He sang because silence had teeth, because his own voice reminded him he was still human. The others pretended to complain. "Give it a rest, Henry. You're scaring the lice." But when he stopped, someone always asked why. One night, they lost 3 men. Shell came down too close, took a piece of the trench with it, took the laughter, No one spoke after dinner, not even to curse the tea. Then Henry started singing, low and cracked, a song about a sailor, or a moon, or a girl who waited too long. And the trench breathed again. Someone hummed along. Someone cried. Someone pretended to be annoyed, but didn't leave. Afterward, no one thanked him. That would have broken the spell, but they slept easier that night. Once, a new officer tried to stop him, said the singing was undisciplined. Henry nodded, said nothing, kept singing the next evening. The officer didn't say another word, and when Henry died, because of course he did, the trench went quiet for 3 days. They found his songbook in his coat, water damaged, unreadable. Still, someone kept it, wrapped it in oilskin, tucked it beneath their kit. Years later, one of the men heard the same tune played on a street piano in a city that hadn't been shelled. He froze, and for a moment, he was back in that trench. Back in that horrible, impossible place, where a boy with a cracked voice sang to no one, and somehow, to everyone. They dreamed, too. Not always, not often. Sleep was scarce and strange in the trenches. But when it came, it pulled hard. Down, down, into the marrow. And the dreams came with it, heavy as sandbags, sharp as shell fragments. Some dreamed of home, of simple things. A door that didn't creak, a loaf of bread warm from the oven, a tree outside the window turning red in autumn. One man dreamed he was a child again, sitting on the floor of his mother's kitchen, listening to the kettle hiss. When he woke, he wept into his sleeve, said nothing. Others dreamed of places they'd never seen, a beach somewhere warm, a bed with clean sheets, a woman whose name they didn't know, but whose arms felt familiar. Some dreamed of death, over and over, not just theirs, but others. The face of the boy they couldn't save, the friend who bled out, saying someone else's name. There were gas dreams, dreams where you ran, but your legs moved through syrup, where you screamed and no sound came out, where the sky turned yellow and your lungs caught fire. Some woke up clawing at their throats. Some didn't wake at all. There were men who stopped dreaming, said it was better, easier, safer. But the dreams found other ways in, through letters, through songs, through the moments between shells, when a bird flew overhead and reminded you that time still moved somewhere else. One man kept a journal of dreams, tiny, water-stained notebook, wrote them down like prayers, dreamed of snow, dreamed of apples, dreamed I kissed a girl with freckles and my hands were clean. Another man claimed to dream in reverse, said he lived the day backward while he slept, woke up tired, like he'd done everything twice. And when the war ended, when the boots came off, and the lice were burned, and the trench was just a memory badly painted on a postcard, some dreams stayed. Decades later, they still woke to the smell of damp wool, still heard the whistle, still looked for a helmet that wasn't there. They tried to forget, but dreams are stubborn, and the trench, once inside you, never really lets go. It just sleeps, and sometimes, late at night, it wakes. He came home, but he didn't come back. That was the cruelest part. You could survive the war, leave the mud behind, fold your uniform neatly and step onto a train, and still be lost. They called it shell shock then. Whispers in the drawing room, nervous disorder, hysteria, men who trembled, stuttered, stared at walls for hours, men who flinched at thunder, who jumped at the clink of cutlery, who burst into tears when someone dropped a plate. They had seen too much, heard too much, been asked to carry what no human soul was ever meant to hold. But the world was not kind to ghosts. There were no parades for the broken, no medals for those who came home limping in the mind. They were hidden, tucked away in hospitals with long, clean halls and no music, sent to country houses turned into asylums, told to rest, told to be quiet. Some never spoke again. Others couldn't stop. One man was found muttering the names of every friend he'd buried, as if by naming them he could raise them. Doctors tried what they could: hydrotherapy, electric shock, tying men to chairs and making them watch sunlight move across the floor. They didn't know what they were doing. How could they? The damage was invisible. A man might look whole, shake your hand, smile for the family photo, then vanish inside himself during dinner, eyes gone dark, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Families tried to understand, tried not to ask too many questions, tried not to cry when the laughter never came back. But how do you love someone who has been rearranged, who still wears your brother's face, but not his jokes, still sleeps in your bed, but wakes up screaming someone else's name. Some left their homes, moved to small towns, took jobs no one asked questions about. Some returned to the trenches in their minds, built them again in the garden, spoke to people who weren't there, saluted birds, and some too many simply ended it, in sheds, in rivers, in letters that said, "I'm tired," and nothing more. Because even after the fighting stopped, the war went on. In dreams, in flashbacks, in the sound of fireworks that made men curl under tables like frightened dogs. It took decades to give it a name that didn't sound like a weakness. Decades to admit that courage can leave bruises. And even now, we forget sometimes. Forget that not all wounds bleed. That some carry their battles in silence, in locked jaws and sleepless nights. So if you ever meet an old man who stares too long at nothing, who touches a tree like he's trying to remember what it felt like to be alive, be gentle. You never know where he's just come back from. They weren't soldiers, not exactly, but they carried the war just the same. The medics, the stretcher bearers, the nurses with hands like saints and backs like iron. They moved through the mud without rifles, no bayonets, no medals for bravery. Just bandages, morphine, and the impossible task of deciding who could be saved. They didn't sleep much. There was always another call, always another cry from the front, always another body too heavy to lift and too broken to leave behind. The stretcher bearers walked into gunfire, not to kill, but to carry, boots slipping on blood, faces set like stone, for hands lifting what was left of a fifth. They were slow, not by choice, because the earth sucked at every step, because bodies are heavy when they're scared, because sometimes a man screamed louder when he knew he was being saved. There were rules, triage, they called it. Green tags, yellow, red, and black. You learned to look fast, one glance at the eyes. The way a chest moved, door didn't, and you had to know, stay or move on. Some couldn't do it, froze when the screaming started, but most learned because someone had to. The dressing stations were barely shelters, tents if they were lucky, ruins if they weren't. They boiled water when they could, cut uniforms off with knives, poured disinfectant into wounds that begged for darkness, amputated with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They whispered, sometimes, to calm, to comfort, to confess. I'm here, you're not alone, this will hurt, but it will pass. This might not pass, but I won't leave you. Some learned to sing, just to drown out the noise, a lullaby for the dying, a hymn for the ones who couldn't scream anymore. And when they wept, because they did wept quietly, behind the tent, into the same apron they'd used to wipe a stranger's face. The nurses, they saw everything, young girls, many of them, volunteers with soft hearts and strong wills. They held hands, wrote letters for men who couldn't see, listened to confessions not meant for this world. One nursed a soldier for 9 weeks. He never spoke, not once. Then, the night he died, he said, "Thank you." That was enough to carry her through the rest of the war. The medics didn't ask why, didn't argue with the sky, didn't pray for glory. They prayed for clean water, for steady hands, for the pain to come in small doses. And when it was over, when the last stretcher was lowered, they didn't celebrate. They slept and dreamed of bandages. They buried them fast, not from disrespect, from necessity. The dead piled up quicker than the living could carry. Sometimes the bodies came back from the line in stretchers. Sometimes they were found days later, half buried, half eaten, half named. There were graves, Sometimes shallow holes dug with shovels that bent under the weight of mud. Crosses made from broken rifles, helmets hung on sticks, names written in chalk, then washed away by rain, and other times no graves at all, just a whispered name, just a hand placed over closed eyes, just a soldier walking away because there were more alive who needed him. They kept lists, or tried to, books stained with rain, sheets torn from field logs, names scratched out, then rewritten. Corporal, private, lieutenant, gone. One man was buried 3 times. His body kept resurfacing. The trench refused him. Another was never found. His brother dug for him every day for a month, until an officer made him stop. Some men wore tags, tin discs strung on twine, but shells didn't respect twine. When a body came in without a face, you guessed, by height, by boots, by what was still in the pockets. And when you couldn't guess, you said a name anyway, even a wrong one, because no one deserves to go into the ground as nothing. Back home, they sent word, letters that began, "We regret to inform you," sometimes to the wrong address, sometimes to mothers who had already guessed, because sometimes grief arrives before confirmation. There were memorials, later, stone arches, walls with names carved in order, rows of white markers in fields where nothing else would grow. But for the ones who were never found, there is only air, only a silence in the earth where they might have been, only the wind carrying a name that fewer and fewer people remember how to pronounce. They called them the missing, but that's not quite right. They weren't missing. They were everywhere, in the mud, in the trees, in the dreams of men who came home to whole and too haunted. They didn't vanish. They seeped into the land. They became part of the trench itself. And when the war ended, the real ending, not the one with parades, the earth kept whispering, still does. Go near those fields today, and if you're quiet, if you really listen, you might feel them beneath your feet, waiting. Not everyone went. That's a truth the war doesn't always confess. There were men who stayed behind, too young, too old, too sick, too lucky, too afraid. They watched the trains leave, watched boys become soldiers in the space between a haircut and a uniform, and they stayed, some by choice, pacifists, poets, farmers who refused to trade plows for rifles, men who said, "I will not kill," and meant it, men who were hated for it. They were called cowards. They were given white feathers, symbols of shame handed by women with hard eyes. Letters arrived with no names. Notes slipped under doors. Traitor, weakling, unmanly, but not all cowards hid. Some walked the streets with heads held high. Some joined ambulance corps. Some ran soup kitchens. Some held the hands of the dying, even if they wouldn't carry a gun. And others just disappeared, into libraries, into back rooms, into silence. Then there were those who couldn't go. Bad hearts, bad lungs, limping from old injuries or just bad timing. They signed up and were turned away. Some wept, others drank, because staying home when everyone else was bleeding felt like theft. They took jobs in factories, drove coal carts, sorted mail for men they'd grown up with, now reduced to names on envelopes. And when the letters stopped coming, they stood outside houses they couldn't knock on, watched curtains close, watched children grow fatherless. They walked streets full of uniforms they'd never wear, listened to speeches meant for braver men, ate dinners that tasted of guilt. Some tried to volunteer again and again, until their bodies broke, or someone told them, finally, you were not needed. But everyone was needed, and some were needed most, by the ones who returned. Because when the war spat the soldiers back, not whole, but breathing, they needed people who remembered how to live, who remembered how to laugh, who knew the names of streets, who knew where the music still played. And those who stayed, those silent, shamed, forgotten men were there. They helped rebuild. They held their brothers. They reminded the world how to speak without shouting. And maybe, just maybe, they were brave in a quieter way. Because war isn't only fought in trenches. Sometimes it's fought in empty chairs, in quiet dinners, in the ache of not being able to bleed for the ones who did. You can leave a battlefield, but it does not leave you. They carried it home in pieces, not medals, not souvenirs. The real things, the invisible luggage, a weight behind the eyes, a sound behind the silence, a stiffness in the hands that never quite let go of the rifle. Some came back and couldn't walk past fireworks. Some came back and never went to church again. Some couldn't sleep in beds, preferring the floor. It felt more honest. They carried habits. Tea brewed too strong. A constant checking of exits. The way they flinched when someone dropped a plate in the kitchen. They carried silence. Answers cut short. Stories that stopped mid-sentence and never resumed. They carried the names of the dead like rosaries. Private Sullivan, Corporal Kenton Charlie, who snored like a bear and whistled through his teeth. They carried guilt. Survivor's guilt. The unbearable why of still being here. Why not me? They carried smells. The sick sweetness of rot. The sour sharpness of gas. The cloying memory of rain on wool. Again and again and again. Some carried rage. Bottled, sealed. It surfaced in traffic, in marriage, in fatherhood. Not violent, just sharp around the edges. A man who spoke too loud, then too soft, who didn't know how to talk about mornings. Some couldn't carry it at all. They left it in bars, in fists, in notes with names no one knew to call. Others tried to bury it in routine. Good jobs, nice gardens, children who didn't ask too many questions. But even then, even years later, something would crack. A smell, a song, the look in someone's eye, and the trench would return. Not the mud, not the rats. Just the feeling of being one breath away from vanishing. But there was one thing more. They carried love, the kind born from men who bled beside each other, who laughed at death and sang in filth and knew, without needing to say it, that they would die for one another, if it came to that. And some did. The survivors carried that too. So if you ever wonder what war leaves behind, look not only at the missing limbs, the faded photographs, the folded flags. Look at the man who can't say why he cries at the sound of boots on gravel, who carries a spoon in his coat just in case, who never throws anything away. Look closely, and you might see he is still walking home. It wasn't supposed to happen. War does not pause. It does not kneel. It does not sing. But on a cold night in December, it did. Somewhere along the Western Front, Belgium most say near Ypres, something impossible unfolded. It was Christmas Eve, 1914. The trenches were quiet, not silent. Never silent, but quieter than usual. The guns had been lazy that day. Snow dusted the ground, thin as lace on an old woman's sleeve. Frost bit the fingers but softened the edges of things. And then singing, faint, at first. Not English, not French, German, still Nollig. Hallig, Nollig, Hallig, Nollig. Silent night, it floated across the no man's land like smoke. The soldiers on the British side froze, listened. Some laughed, thought it was a trick. But the singing didn't stop. It got louder, clearer, so they joined in. In English, in halting cigarette-worn voices. Same tune, different words. Same hope, different uniforms. Two armies, mud-covered, lice-bitten, blood-slicked, singing the same song to the same stars. And then something else. A figure, standing, no rifle, no helmet. Just a German soldier, hands raised, walking into the middle. No shots fired, another followed, then another. And then an Englishman, then two. And just like that, the war stopped. They shook hands. They offered cigarettes, chocolate, rum. Someone had a soccer ball, God knows from where. They played. Not well, not seriously, but they played. In the middle of a battlefield, where hours before men had died choking on mud and iron, they kicked a ball under a sky full of silent stars. They showed each other photographs of sweethearts, of mothers, of dogs. One German had been a waiter in London. He asked if Piccadilly was still as loud as he remembered. Another asked about cricket. No one could explain the rules. They laughed, and for a few hours they were not enemies, not uniforms, just men. Some swapped buttons. One traded a hat. Another carved a small toy horse and gave it to a boyish British soldier who promised to send it home to his sister. They buried their dead. Together, dug shallow graves, said prayers in different tongues that somehow still meant the same thing. Rest. Forgive, remember. And when dawn came, they returned. Back to their trenches. Back to the war. A whistle blew, and the killing began again. But something had changed. For a moment, just one, the war forgot itself. And in that pause, in that quiet night, when men laid down their rifles and sang to the stars, the world remembered what it meant to be human. It wasn't official. No papers were signed. No orders given. The generals didn't sanction it. The politicians pretended it never happened. But the men remembered. Word of the truce spread slowly, like warmth through old bones. Some sectors heard singing. Others saw lanterns strung along trench Egostini lights in a world built of shadow. And where there was hesitation, there was hope. Messages were scrawled on cardboard, held up above the parapet like schoolchildren raising hands. You know, shoot. We know, shoot. And they didn't. For a night sometimes, too, the war stopped itself. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to share biscuits across barbed wire. Enough to trade a tin of beef for a pair of dry socks. Enough to see the face of a man you'd been told was your enemy, and find he looked tired, just like you. Some played music, a harmonica here, a violin, miraculously unbroken there. One group sang bawdy songs. Another attempted a carol and got halfway through before someone started laughing too hard to finish. The laughter mattered. It cracked the frost of fear. Let the air in. One man offered a comb. Another, a sausage wrapped in waxed paper. It didn't matter what was exchanged. It mattered that someone offered something and someone else took it with both hands. There were prayers, mumbled in accents too thick to follow, but the rhythm of reverence needs no translation. They marked the graves together, stood shoulder to shoulder. One British soldier wrote afterward, "We buried them like friends." I don't know what else to call it. And for a few strange, luminous hours, there was no side. No us, no them. Only people, hungry, cold, homesick. Men spoke of what they missed. Eggs, pubs, the smell of bread, the sound of church bells, not warning of artillery. They asked about families, pets, the names of rivers far away from this blasted, broken stretch of land. And sometimes quietly they asked, "Why are we doing this?" Not to argue, just to wonder. Because in that suspended hush, when the sky stayed dark and the stars blinked like they'd always known better, the question felt aloud. There was no answer, but the asking changed something. When the truce ended, they didn't shake hands again, didn't nod, they just returned, slipped back into their holes, picked up their rifles with hands that felt suddenly too heavy. The war resumed, but the memory stayed. Not in the history books, not right away, but in letters, in drawings, in a bullet dented by a pocket watch and still kept in a drawer for years after. Because once, on a night when the world should have burned, it chose, for a breath, to sing instead. They weren't all pleased. Not everyone saw the truce as a miracle. In higher places, far from the frost, far from the rats, far from the smell of open wounds and boiled socks, the generals frowned. They saw fraternization. They saw discipline slipping. They saw men forgetting who they were supposed to hate. And hate, after all, is useful in war. So when word reached headquarters, when reports filtered in of soccer matches and shared brandy, of men who once aimed rifles, now exchanging addresses, they sent orders. Stop it. No more handshakes, no more singing, no more shared cigarettes passed like communion wafers across the scarred earth. Punishments were threatened. Artillery schedules were resumed. Raids were ordered the next day, as if to bleach the kindness from the soil. But not all officers agreed. Some had watched the truce unfold from the parapet, had seen their men rise slowly, trembling from disbelief, and walk out into the open like sleepwalkers. They hadn't stopped them. Some even joined. One British lieutenant later wrote, "I stood beside a German. He offered me a cigar. I lit it. We stood there, two sons of different empires, sharing warmth in a field meant only for death." He didn't report it. What was there to say? "Dear Command, today I remembered we're all human." Others looked the other way, pretended not to hear the singing, didn't ask why their men's pockets smelled faintly of sausage, didn't question the unfamiliar buttons sewn into greatcoats. They knew the war would come back. They knew this peace was borrowed. But some part of them, the part still capable of sleep, hoped it might leave a scar in the right place. One German officer was reprimanded for refusing to order fire the next morning. He stood his ground, said, "I will not kill someone who just showed me a photograph of his daughter." He was transferred, quietly, as if to suggest that decency was contagious. Back in London, back in Berlin, the papers kept quiet. The truce didn't fit the narrative. You couldn't recruit with stories of hugs in no man's land. But word got out. Letters leaked. Songs were written. Drawings made their way home. Sketches of men with different helmets laughing in snow. And somewhere, in a quiet office, a general signed another order and paused, just briefly, to wonder what it meant the soldiers had to be reminded to hate. Because some officers, just a few, knew the truth, that the real danger wasn't bullets. It was the moment you looked someone in the eye and saw yourself. It wasn't just silent night. That was the beginning, yes, the one most remembered. But after the first few verses floated across the frozen dark, other songs joined in. Songs in German, French, English, songs from farms and cities, from beer halls and cathedrals, from mothers' voices and street corners where boys once busked for coin. They sang in rounds, not always together, not always on key, but something in the music stitched the silence shut. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way choirs are, but it was true, ragged, earnest, like a child humming in the dark to keep the monsters away. Some of the Germans sang carols unknown to the British. Some British soldiers tried to join, mouthing the words phonetically. They laughed when they got them wrong. One voice would begin thin, tentative, and others would gather around it like moths to a weak flame. The wind carried it. The song became a thread pulled across no man's land, tugging at hearts, unraveling orders, undoing, if only for a moment, the great lie of separation. One Frenchman began a love ballad, soft and slow. He didn't finish. Too many tears in his throat. A Welsh soldier replied with a hymn. Even the Germans went quiet for that one. It felt like a funeral and a birth, both. Some sang in languages no one understood, but understanding wasn't the point. The point was sound. The point was to lift something, anything, above the mud, to remind the sky that the ground still remembered joy, to say, we are still here, we still know the melody. There are stories of harmonicas, of fiddles miraculously unharmed, of men crafting flutes from shell casings, just for this one night. Music, when it lives in your blood, does not require permission. It finds a way. And that night, it found its way through the war. Even the officers, some of them, stood still. Let the cold wrap around them. Let the notes settle like ash. One soldier wrote, "It was the only time I believed the war might be undone not by strategy, but by song." By morning, most of the songs had faded, lost in wind, buried beneath orders. But for those who heard them, those who added their voices, the war sounded different, after, like something that could be quieted, even if only for a verse. They tried not to talk about it afterward. The truce, that is. Some were ashamed, not of what they did, but of how deeply it hurt to go back. Because after shaking hands with a man, after sharing jokes and names and broken songs, you had to aim your rifle at him again. And that broke something. It had to. For weeks afterward, some soldiers hesitated, missed shots on purpose, fired over heads, moved slower, and the war noticed. Officers rotated the regiments, split up companies that had joined in the truce, scattered the memory before it took root, but it already had. In the letters sent home, in the sketches smuggled out, in the trembling of a hand that no longer believed its trigger finger belonged to it. Some men kept souvenirs, a button, a ribbon, a cigarette tin engraved with a name they couldn't pronounce but would never forget. One carved a chess piece for the German he played against. Another wrote a poem, then never showed it to anyone. It was found folded in his kit after he died, still wrapped in oilcloth. There were stories, never confirmed, that some men warned the others of raids, whispered across the lines, "Move left tomorrow, don't be there at dawn." Not often, not enough to matter, but enough to haunt. Back home, when the stories trickled out, people didn't know what to make of them. They wanted heroes, not friends of the enemy, wanted glory, not tenderness. But the soldiers knew better. They had seen it. The flicker of something ancient and decent in the eyes of a man who should have been aiming at their heart. It didn't change the war. Nothing did. Millions still died. But the memory lingered. And sometimes, that's all we get. A glimpse, a moment. Proof that even in the worst hell, there is space for something kind, something human, that beneath the layers of uniform, mud, and orders, shouted by men who had never bled, there was a face, and behind that face, a soul. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, souls recognize each other and sing. They weren't supposed to draw, not officially. There were more pressing duties, more immediate needs. Bullets to count, boots to dry, lice to kill. But still, they drew, on scraps of cardboard, on the backs of orders, on napkins stolen from the officers' mess. They drew what the war refused to speak. Not battle plans or flags or explosions, but moments. A man leaning on a shovel, staring at nothing. A mug of tea, cradled like it held salvation. The silhouette of a friend, lit by a flare, smoking a cigarette like it was a sacrament. They sketched rats, endless rats, fat and proud and laughing. One man drew a whole comic strip about a rat named Percy who ran a black market cheese ring beneath the trenches. Another filled a notebook with portraits. Men asleep, men mid-laugh, men who were gone the next morning. He drew their names underneath. Sometimes just first names. Sometimes just a letter and a shape that looked like a heart. One carved faces into matchsticks. Tiny things, eyes barely dots, but somehow full of expression. He handed them out like charms before a battle. Some painted, used boot polish for shadows, blood for reds. They weren't making art, they were making proof. Proof that they had seen what they'd seen, that they had felt what they felt, because the camera couldn't capture it. The reports didn't care, and memory lies when it tries to survive, but a sketch tells the truth sideways. One soldier sent his mother a drawing of a sunrise. It wasn't accurate. It was too warm, too hopeful. But he wrote beneath it, "This is what I remember, not what I see." Others weren't so gentle. There are drawings still archived of bodies in wire, of faces half buried in mud, of hands reaching from craters like prayers that never got finished. They weren't for display, weren't for museums. They were for sanity, for the soul, for the part of a man that needed to create in a place built entirely to destroy. And when the war ended, some packed those sketchbooks away, never looked at them again. But some kept them close, like maps out of the darkness, like mirrors for the things they could not say. Because sometimes, when words are mud and memory is smoke, a pencil becomes the only way home. They weren't supposed to write poetry either. Poetry was for schools, salons, 4 rooms with soft chairs and clean hands. Not for trenches, not for the wet, rusted skeleton of a war gone mad. But still, they wrote, in pencil, mostly, on the backs of ration cards, inside helmet liners, on toilet paper, when there was nothing else. They wrote because silence is too loud when you're scared. Because sometimes a rhyme is the only way to hold pain without dropping it. It wasn't elegant, always, not carefully metered or classically trained, but it was raw and it was true. One man wrote about socks, 3 stanzas on the miracle of dry wool. It made the whole trench laugh. Another wrote about God, but not the clean church, God of hymnals and polished pews. The God of mud and steel and whispered curses. A God who hid, but maybe still listened. Some poems were letters in disguise, lines to a mother, a girl, a brother they couldn't quite talk to anymore. Others were lists, the names of friends who hadn't made it, turned into verses, so they'd be remembered as more than statistics. One wrote a haiku every day for a month, called it his bulletproof diary. He said it helped keep the darkness in check, like planting flowers in a graveyard. And then there were the poets we still read. Wilfred Owen, who wrote about gas like it was a serpent, who bled beauty into horror and didn't flinch. Siegfried Sassoon, who turned irony into a weapon, who wrote about generals sipping wine while boys drowned in ditches. Rupert Brooke, who died too early to see the worst of it, but left behind words soft as lullabies, like he was trying to write heaven into being before hell arrived. They weren't heroes, not in the way statues suggest, but they told the truth. And truth, in war, is rare and holy. Sometimes they read their work aloud, by candle stub, with rats scratching nearby. Men would nod, or chuckle, or wipe something from their eyes, and pretend it was just the smoke. Because poetry isn't about answers, it's about naming the ache, about saying, I see it too. And that meant everything. Because when the war stripped away your name, your voice, your place in the world, a few lines of verse were a way to say, I was here, I mattered, I felt this. Yes, they even performed, in dugouts, in makeshift shelters carved into the side of a hill, on planks of wood laid across crates of ammunition. Theatre, comedy, skits with dresses made of sandbags and moustaches drawn on with coal. Laughter in the mouth of war. They called them concert parties, or trench shows, improvised, ridiculous, beautiful things. There were no curtains, no lights beyond a few candles stuck into bottles, no tickets, just a crowd of mud-covered men, grateful for anything that wasn't orders, or screaming, or the eternal sound of dripping water. They performed songs, rewritten with trench lyrics, mocked officers, mocked the weather, mocked the rats with elaborate ballads and choreographed stomps. One man did a perfect impression of their colonel. It nearly got him court-martialed. The colonel laughed so hard he let it go. There were plays, too. Shakespeare, mostly. Lines delivered with muddy boots and makeshift swords. To an audience that would have traded all the king's horses and all the king's men for one clean pair of socks. They cheered, laughed too loud, clapped with gloves still wet, because for an hour they were not soldiers, not shadows, just people, actors, jokers, fools, and fools, it turned out, had power. The power to remind everyone that there was still joy somewhere, however fragile, however stupid, however covered in lice. One man played Juliet, complete with mop-head wig and smudged lipstick made from beetroot. He took a bow with exaggerated grace, and someone threw a can of corned beef in admiration. It was perfect. Another read a monologue he'd written himself, about a dream where the war never started. No one clapped, they just sat still. Letting it settle, they performed for the wounded. Carried their broken friends into makeshift theaters, propped them up with cushions. One man whispered, laughing hurts, and did it anyway. Sometimes they performed just for themselves. Two men, a torn blanket, a joke they'd rehearsed under shellfire. No audience, just the need to keep the spark alive. And when the shelling resumed, as it always did, they packed up their props, folded their scripts, returned to the trench. But they carried something back. Not armor, not orders. A line, a punchline. A memory of someone pretending to be a queen in the middle of the world's filthiest kingdom. It made them human. And in a war designed to grind men down into numbers, that was everything. Most photos were staged. Men lined up with clean uniforms, helmets tilted just so, rifles gleaming in the sun that never touched the front lines. These were the images sent home, the ones printed in papers, the ones meant to reassure. Look, our boys, smiling, strong, intact. But that wasn't the truth. The real photos, the ones that slipped through, they told a different story. They were blurry, overexposed, taken without permission, without posing. A hand gripping a trench wall, knuckles white, mud caked so deep it had become part of the skin. A man asleep with his head against a sandbag, mouth open, one boot missing. A dead bird tied to a stick. A joke someone didn't finish explaining. One soldier smuggled a small camera in his kit, took pictures of rats, of clouds, of the way the light hit a friend's face before a raid. That friend didn't come back. The camera survived, and years later, someone found the film still in the back. Developed it. The photo was blurry. The eyes were closed. But it mattered, because it was real. There are photographs of boots left behind, of tea mugs half buried in the earth, of graffiti scrawled in desperate hands. Tomorrow, who knows? Tell Mabel I danced. Some images caught the aftermath, faces turned away, bodies wrapped in tarps. A medic smoking beside a stretcher, his eyes so empty you wonder how they were ever filled. These photos didn't make the papers. They weren't framed. They were folded, tucked into books, hidden under floorboards. Not because they were shameful, but because they were sacred. You don't display a wound, you carry it. Sometimes a photo survived the war, but not the years. Creased too many times, burned in a moment of pain, lost in a move, forgotten in a drawer no one opened again, but some remained. And when you look at them, really look, you see what war can't lie about. Not uniforms, not flags, not victory, just eyes, looking back, saying without words, this happened, I was there. Please remember me as more than what they wrote down. The war tried to erase everything, names, places, faces, even memories, rubbed raw by time and trauma until they barely resembled the truth. But some things refuse to be forgotten. Ink, for one, not the kind that dries on orders and newspapers, the kind pressed into skin, into pages, into the quiet places where grief goes when it has nowhere left to live. Some soldiers got tattoos, crude things, a date, a name, a cross on the wrist or a heart over the ribs. One man tattooed his brother's initials onto his forearm the day after he buried him, said, he can't be lost if he's part of me. Others wrote poems and hid them in their boots, wrote their thoughts on the linings of coats, so close to the chest that the words began to shape the heart. And some wrote nothing at all, just carved their stories into silence, into stares, into the way their hands trembled when they touched paper. But those who wrote, they saved more than themselves. A diary found in a tin box under a bed, page after page of mud and fear and longing, punctuated with tea stains and misspellings. The handwriting gets smaller near the end, as if the writer couldn't bear the sound of his own thoughts anymore. A letter that never got sent, addressed only to the girl with the yellow ribbon. The envelope is sealed. No one knows what it says, but it was kept so it mattered. There are entire novels buried in footnotes, in marginalia, in sketches drawn in the corners of field manuals. Some wrote about rats, some about stars, some about God in a way that made it clear they were still angry with him. And when the war ended, when the boots came off and the trenches filled with rain, the ink stayed. Long after the uniforms rotted, long after the medals dulled, long after the flags were folded into drawers that no one opened on purpose, the ink remained. In books, in journals, in letters pressed to lips and wept over in kitchens that never saw war, but knew it all the same. And the best part, it still does. In poems recited at dusk, in dusty anthologies opened by students who don't yet understand. In the way a line of verse can stop you in your tracks and make you remember someone you never met. Because some truths, the deepest ones, aren't shouted or carved in stone. They're whispered in ink. And ink, if you're lucky, outlives the noise. When the war ended, it didn't feel like it. There were bells, of course, cheering, papers waving from windows, the word armistice printed in bold type, as if ink could declare a soul healed. But in the trenches, what was left of them, there was only silence. The guns stopped. Suddenly, awkwardly, as if someone had pulled a plug on a scream that had lasted too long. And the men, they didn't cheer. Not all of them. Some stood blinking, waiting for the next shell, the next shout, the next order that never came. Some sat down, in the mud, in the quiet, as if the earth had finally given them permission to rest. Others wept, not from joy, but from something heavier, the kind of sorrow that doesn't make noise. Because what do you do when the thing that's been trying to kill you suddenly lets go? When the rhythm of death stops, and you have to remember how to breathe without flinching. They didn't know what to do with their hands, what to do with their boots, what to do with their thoughts. Some wandered back into old shelters, sat with ghosts, lit a final cigarette, left it burning in the mud as an offering. They looked at each other, at the ones who remained, at the gaps where others should have been. No one said it, but they all felt it. We are not the same. And then came the going home, or the attempt. The uniforms were kept on for the train rides, like armor for the strange new world they were about to enter. The medals hadn't arrived yet, but the stairs had. Some towns welcomed them like kings. Banners, brass bands, baked pies. Others didn't know what to say. What do you say to a man who hasn't smiled in years? To someone who flinches when the clock strikes the hour? They gave them jobs, or tried to, but some hands couldn't hold tools anymore. Some ears couldn't handle the sound of hammers. Some minds couldn't remember how to stand in line without a rifle. And the silence, the real silence, settled in. Not peace, not really, just the absence of noise. And behind that absence, the long, slow ache of remembering what used to be. Because the war had ended, but it hadn't gone. It echoed, in doorways, in dreams, in the way people crossed the street to avoid asking how you were. And so they sat, or walked, or drifted, in a world that had rearranged itself, made new borders, built new statues, but never quite figured out what to do with the men who had outlived the noise. They didn't march back, not like they went out. There were no flowers tucked into rifles, no songs, no sense of ceremony. They came home in parts. Not limbs, though some did, but in pieces of themselves. Shards carried in the seams of jackets, in the way their eyes flicked toward shadows. Their families tried, of course they did. Mothers cooked too much. Fathers poured drinks and offered nothing but clumsy pats. Siblings stared, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. And the soldier, the boy, the man, the echo, stood in the doorway like a visitor in his own life. The boots were the wrong size now, the bed too soft, the street too quiet. Even the trees felt different. He tried to help, tried to smile at the right times, tried to answer the same questions with new words. But some things had no words. No one asked about the smell of gas, about the moment you realized your best friend wouldn't finish his sentence, about what it feels like to bury someone with your bare hands because the shovels were being used somewhere else. So he said nothing. Or he drank, or he worked until his knuckles bled, or he sat in the backyard for hours, watching the birds and not trusting them, because birds had flown over the trenches, too, unbothered, unafraid. Some tried church, some tried silence, some tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but it had, and it wouldn't unhappen. It was there in the rattling of a window during a storm, in the way children shouted too loudly in the street, in the sound of beans boiling over on the stove, too close to the whistle of a shell. They brought bones home, too. Boxes, flags, folded too tight. letters from captains written in careful grief. They were buried in neat rows, with brass plaques and quiet ceremonies. But the real graves were elsewhere. In kitchen chairs no one sat in anymore. In birthdays remembered with a flinch. In the way someone turned away from the sight of a young man in uniform, because they had once had one just like him, and he never returned. The war had come home, in boots and bones, in memories and nightmares, in the long pauses between questions. And the world, grateful and ashamed in equal measure, tried to build something new around the wreckage. But the wreckage remained, because some wars don't end. They just come inside, sit down, and stay. They built monuments. Of course they did. It's what humans do. When grief gets too big to carry, we turn it into stone. Tall ones, mostly, granite, marble, bronze. Figures with chiseled jaws and fixed gazes, standing forever in places where no fighting had happened, but where people needed to feel something anyway. They carved names, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds, lines and lines of letters that looked more like prayers than records. Some names were misspelled, some repeated, some forgotten entirely, because there were no teeth left to match them to. But still, we built arches, tombs, crosses rising from grass, so green it felt insulting. We laid wreaths, we bowed heads, we said things like never again, and meant it, for a little while. There were statues of soldiers, some looking brave, some looking tired. One famously slumped, his rifle forgotten, his gaze turned inward, like he was already halfway gone. Children were taken on field trips, told to be quiet, told to look, told to remember men they never knew. And people did remember. For a time, they wore poppies. They held silence. They stood still while bugles cried into the wind. But monuments can only hold so much, and stone does not bleed. The mothers remembered better. So did the widows, and the ones who had kissed someone goodbye and spent the next 50 years waiting for the sound of their voice in a dream. The monuments couldn't hold the letters that never arrived, or the shoes never worn again, or the chair that stayed empty through every meal. They couldn't hold the way someone's name made a room go silent. Couldn't hold the guilt of a man who came back when his brother didn't. Couldn't hold the way the war clung to some people like a second skin. But they tried, and we tried, because grief, like war, doesn't need permission to take up space. It just does. And if we can't erase it, we shape it, we smooth it, we make it last. So that someday, someone might walk past a wall full of names, run their fingers over the carving, and whisper, "You were here. I see you. You mattered." The war didn't just take lives. It took futures. All across Europe, and beyond, there were empty places where lives might have bloomed. Not just graves, not just names carved in stone, but chairs never sat in, hands never held, laughter never given a voice, a man who might have written books, another who could have mended clocks, the kind with delicate gears and quiet ticking hearts, a boy who never became a teacher, a son who would have learned to fish like his grandfather, a poet who never found her words because the man who inspired them bled into the soil of the some. They are the almosts, the children never born, the houses never built, the songs never sung past the first verse. A woman wrote, "I was going to marry him in spring. I wore the dress anyway." Just once. Another kept his letters, tied in a ribbon that faded faster than her memory of his voice. Whole generations shifted because of who wasn't there, who didn't come back to kiss someone, didn't come back to argue over bread or sing off-key, or fall asleep in the wrong armchair. Families became smaller, lonelier, quieter. And no one noticed, not at first, the lives that never had the chance to interrupt. The empty spaces didn't cry, didn't demand, they simply didn't appear. But some people felt them, every day. Like a coat they hadn't meant to put on, but couldn't seem to take off. The world moved on, as it does. The war ended. The factories roared again. Children grew up. The wounded healed or hid. But the lives that almost were, they never left. They linger in photographs without names, in journals with a single page written, in letters with no return address, and sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the wind moves through the grass in just the right way, someone might pause, turn their head, and feel it. A presence, a weight, a gentle absence, just behind the moment. The life that almost was, still waiting to be remembered. Some things were never explained, not to the mothers, not to the widows, not to the men who sat in pubs, fingers trembling round pint glasses as they asked, again, why? Why did one boy come home and another didn't? Why did the shell land there, not here? Why did the letter arrive 3 days too late? Why did they send them over the top, knowing what was waiting? The answers, if they came, were late, or vague, or wrapped in ribbons of patriotism, too tight to breathe through, necessary, strategic, heroic. But none of those words could bring someone back, and so the questions stayed, not as cries, as whispers, carried through kitchens and churchyards and long walks that ended without the peace they had hoped to find. Some men stopped asking, because the silence that followed hurt more than not knowing. Others kept asking until their last breath, as if God might one day answer when all the other voices had fallen away. Children asked, too. What was it like? Did you kill anyone? Were you afraid? And sometimes the answer was a laugh, sometimes a stare, sometimes the back of a hand on the table, tapping a rhythm no one else could hear. Some questions didn't have language. What does it mean to watch a friend's body disappear into the fog and never find it again? What do you say to the man who took your place on the firing line and didn't come back? What do you do with the part of yourself that never left the trench? The world tried to move on, held ceremonies, built statues, gave medals, but the questions clung to the edges, not loud, not bitter, just there. And maybe that's the truest inheritance of war. Not flags, not songs, not history books, but questions, carried forward by those too young to have been there, but old enough to feel the echo. Would he have been kind? Did she think of me? Did they know it was over? And the questions, they never stop, because love never does. And grief only quiets. It never forgets. The war was supposed to end war. They called it the Great War, as if size were the measure of sorrow, as if magnitude could substitute for meaning. And when it was over, when the trenches were filled in and the uniforms packed away, the world looked around and said, never again. But time forgets. It forgets the mud, the screaming, the way men stared at the sky like it owed them an explanation. And so, less than 30 years later, there was another one. Louder, faster, even more cruel. The Second War inherited the silence of the first. The same eyes, the same fear, just with different maps and new machines. But the First War left more than bones behind. It left a different kind of wound, not jagged deep. It shifted how nations saw themselves, how empires collapsed, how people questioned the banners they had once cheered under. It created lines on maps and cracks in belief. It toppled kings. It tore open the idea that glory and death were ever meant to share a sentence. It changed art, poetry, politics, medicine. It made cynics out of romantics and philosophers out of teenagers. The League of Nations rose from its ashes. So did jazz and modernism, and entire generations of men who never spoke of what they'd seen but flinched when a car backfired. It shifted war from honor to industry, introduced gas masks and tanks, barbed wire and bureaucracy. It turned death into something you could schedule, something you could measure per yard gained. It taught people how to mourn together, how to bury thousands at once and still look for one face in the crowd. It made us ask if civilization was real or just a story we told ourselves when the guns ran out of bullets. And in some strange, tired way, it brought people closer. Not through trust, through loss, because grief is a universal language, and pain, when shared, starts to look like solidarity. The First World War didn't end the world, but it ended something inside it. A certain kind of innocence, a certain kind of story about what humans are. It replaced it with something else, not better, but more honest. A world that had looked into the mirror of its own making and seen, for the first time, just how far it could fall. You can still find them, in France, in Belgium, in the places where the earth was turned inside out. Not just the cemeteries, though there are many. Rows upon rows of white stones standing like teeth in the jaw of history. But in the fields, in the forests, in the quiet corners where no one looks too closely. They call it the iron harvest. Each spring, when farmers plow the soil, they find pieces, shells, shrapnel, bullets that never found a body, and sometimes still bodies. Skeletons curled like question marks. Dog tags still rusted to bone. A boot with a foot still inside it. The earth does not forget. It carries everything. Some of the shells are live, unexploded, a century old, still deadly. The bomb squads come quietly, like gardeners of violence. They remove the past one piece at a time, and still it keeps returning. You can walk in these fields today. You can run your hand through the grass and touch metal that once tore through lungs. You can kneel beside a stone marked known unto God and feel the air vibrate with all the things that never got said. The trees there are strange. Some still grow at angles. Some are younger than the graves beside them, planted afterward to keep the wind from howling too loud. And the birds, they sing. They always do. But sometimes it sounds like they're remembering, too. There are trenches still visible, faint lines through farmland, overgrown, softened by time, but still present, like wrinkles on the face of a world that survived something too big to name. Locals know not to dig too deep, not for superstition, for safety, because the war left more than ghosts in the ground. It left chemicals, toxins, gas that still poisons the roots of trees, still lingers in puddles after the rain. Some places are off limits, red zones, too dangerous to reclaim, too scarred. They are left as they were, as warnings, as wounds left open on purpose. And yet life grows. Dandelions, wild poppies, crops, even in the safer soil. The world insists on continuing, even where it bled. But if you listen closely, if you walk those fields alone in the early hours when fog still clings to the hedgerows, you can feel it, not fear, not even sadness, just the weight of memory, soft, relentless, and still very much alive. They didn't all die. That's important to remember. We call them the lost generation, the poets, the painters, the thinkers, the ones who came home and never quite knew how to live in the world they'd reinterred. But they weren't lost, not really. They were changed. They carried the war not as a flag, but as a quiet rhythm under the skin. You could hear it in their pauses, in the way they looked at crowds, in the way they built things that didn't last or refused to build at all. Some wrote Hemingway, Graves, Remark, lines that bled truth, that stripped war of its shine and left it naked in the cold. Some painted, shapes broken, colors too sharp, or faded like memories you try to forget but can't. Some turned to politics, became loud, became quiet, became angry in ways they didn't always understand, and some just lived. They ran shops, they taught school, they drank more than they meant to. They married, not always out of love, sometimes out of need, sometimes because the silence of being alone was too close to the silence after shellfire. They had children, told stories, some true, some softened. They built a world that did not know what to do with men who had once crawled through dirt to cradle a dying friend, and now found themselves arguing about the price of bread, and yet they kept going. Because that's what survival is. Not triumph, not drama, just motion. One foot, then the next. They laughed, too. Eventually. Sometimes in bursts. Sometimes so suddenly it frightened them. And when the Second War came, because it did, many of them watched it unfold with a grief too old for anger. They had already buried that part of themselves, but they gave what they could. Their sons, their knowledge, their fear carefully wrapped in advice. And when that war ended, they were the ones sitting on benches in parks, watching children run, whispering to themselves, let them never know, not just about death, about waiting, about how it feels to love someone in a trench and not know which of you will rise in the morning. They weren't lost, they were changed, and they carried the world forward, on backs bent not from labor, but from memory. The world after the war was loud, radios, engines, cities swelling with horns and footsteps, and the static buzz of something trying to forget. The silence of the trenches didn't follow most people, but for some, it never left. It hummed beneath the music. It echoed in the spaces between elevator doors. It waited, and in time, it transformed. The war was no longer just memory. It became curriculum, documentary, black and white footage set to solemn violins. It became something students studied, that scholars debated, that statesmen invoked. But for the ones who had known the real noise, not the speeches, not the newsreels, but the noise of men breaking open the new world sounded strange, too cheerful, too confident, too fast. They watched as history forgot to stutter, as timelines smoothed themselves, as old wounds were narrated in past tense, even though some of them were still bleeding. Children asked questions, sometimes earnestly, sometimes for homework. Were you in the war? A pause, a shrug, sometimes a story, one with no ending, sometimes just a long look out the window. The noise of the new century came with jazz, with revolution, with dancing, shouting, the roar of planes, and the scream of radios reporting everything before the ink was even dry. And yet beneath it all, the war remained, not loudly, not often, but enough to stop a breath in a crowd, enough to make an old man's hand shake when a kettle whistled, enough to make someone cry at the sound of bagpipes, even if they didn't know why. The world wore its noise like armor, busy, bright, unflinching. But underneath, beneath the concrete and brass bands, was the old rhythm. Boom, pause, breath, gone. The war had given the world its volume, but it had also left a silence so deep that some would spend their whole lives trying not to hear it. Time softens everything, edges dull, blood dries. The sharp heat of grief cools into something quieter, like a coat that doesn't quite fit anymore, but you wear it anyway because it's yours. And so, the First World War became memory, layered, folded, stored in attics and archives and school books, with margin notes about dates and treaties. The faces faded, the numbers grew, the names began to sound less like people and more like monuments. But even memory-worn thing can still warm you, because some things linger, not in facts, but in feeling, in the hush before a minute of silence, in the crackle of old recordings, in the tremble of a voice remembering someone who never got old. Some families still keep the letters, the medals, the photographs with blank-eyed boys standing too straight beside mud-darkened wagons. They don't always know who they were, but they keep them, because to throw them away would be to admit the silence won. Others still visit the graves, leave poppies, trace the names with fingers, stand in cold wind and try to imagine what it meant to be 20 and never know 21. Museums try their best. They dim the lights, they play the sounds. They build replicas of trenches, let children walk through with wide eyes and clean shoes. But you can't teach the smell, the fear, the absurd, awful camaraderie of knowing you might die beside a man who still owes you a cigarette. You can only suggest, only whisper, and hope someone listens. And sometimes they do, not just on anniversaries, not just when the trumpet plays, but late at night, when the world is quiet and someone picks up a book or an old diary and reads the words of a boy who signed it, yours until the shells fall. Because memory is not about holding everything. It's about refusing to let everything go. It's about saying, you mattered, even now, even here. And so we remember, not perfectly, not always out loud, but deeply, like a song you forgot you knew, until someone hums it, and your heart joins in. Their fields now, rolling green, quiet, spotted with wildflowers and the occasional fence. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. The grass grows soft, the hills have softened their edges, and the birds, they sing again. But beneath the surface, it's still there. The lines, the scars, the old bones. Some places are preserved, museums without walls, snaking paths of trench line, timber still in place, dugouts reinforced like memories refusing to collapse. Tourists walk them, heads bowed, whispers rising like prayers. They marvel at the mud. They peer through periscopes. They read the signs. But some do more. Some come to feel, to listen, because the land remembers, not in sound but in pressure, a kind of weight in the air, as if the ground itself is holding its breath, still waiting for someone to come back. There are places where the grass won't grow quite right, where the trees lean just slightly wrong, where birds avoid nesting. No reason, just instinct. Locals know the names. The Hollow, the Red Field, Devil's Corner. Old men nod toward them and say nothing more. At sunrise, mist crawls along the low places, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that something is still moving, that the war walks here, not to haunt, but to endure, to insist it was real. Children play nearby, they always do. Their laughter bright, unguarded, and that's good. That's the point. But every now and then, a ball goes too far. A child goes quiet, stands at the edge of something they don't understand and whispers. It feels weird here, and it does, because the land keeps what we bury, not just bodies, but stories, fears, promises whispered to a sky full of artillery. They say the war ended in 1918, but walk these fields really, walk them and you'll feel it. the echo still pulsing, still breathing, just beneath the roots. They come alone, mostly, quietly, no fanfare. Just suitcases, walking shoes, and a name folded carefully in a jacket pocket. Some are old, with hands like dried paper, and eyes that scan for ghosts. Some are young, with questions they can't quite name, drawn to a silence that feels larger than history. They are pilgrims, but not for saints. They come for the boys who never came home. 4 great-grandfathers whose names live only in dusty ledgers. 4 uncles spoken of in half-sentences, as if grief never quite let the rest through. They come to stand where someone stood, to breathe the air, to say, I found you, even if the grave reads known unto God. Some bring flowers, some bring whiskey. One man brought a harmonica, played it trembling, then left it beneath a tree. It's still there. They walk the paths slowly, not because they're tired, but because the ground feels sacred, like a cathedral with no roof, where prayers rise straight into the wind. They touch the stones, run fingers over names, whisper them, not loud, just enough, because saying a name out loud is one way to love the dead. They visit small cemeteries, forgotten by most. 30 graves, a bench, a rusted gate. They sit there, sometimes for hours, not talking, not crying, just keeping company. Some bring photographs, hold them up like offerings. Compare the face of a laughing boy in uniform to the flat certainty of a birth-to-death date. Others bring letters, still unopened, written by hands that thought they had time. A woman brought a locket, opened it, closed it, buried it in the grass. No words, just tears that fell in a straight line, like they'd been waiting. These are not tourists, they do not pose, they are pilgrims, and they are mourning something larger than one life. They are mourning possibility, the shape of a world that could have been but wasn't. They do not ask for answers, only presence, only a moment to feel what can't be taught, what can't be explained, only remembered. They still write them, you know, letters to the dead. Not as many now, but enough, folded into envelopes and slipped into cracks in headstones, tucked beneath wreaths, left in plastic sleeves at the foot of memorial walls. Some are simple, I miss you. Others are pages long, updates on marriages, children, regrets, wars that came after. One began with, you died before I was born, but I still feel you. Another, your name was always spoken like a secret in our house. I wanted to see where you last stood. They are not dramatic. They are not for show. They are fragments, offerings, tiny attempts to mend the great rip between what was and what almost was. And the strange thing, sometimes people reply. Strangers, other visitors, caretakers. A letter left on a grave in Ypres was answered a week later, an envelope taped beside it. I don't know who you are, but your words made me cry. Thank you. The ghosts of this war aren't loud. They don't rattle chains. They don't scream in dreams. They sit beside you, quietly. They hover near museum glass. They wait in photographs that have been looked at too long. And sometimes they speak, not in words. In reminders, in the sudden chill, in the urge to cry while staring at a poppy. In the quiet understanding that someone once died so young and so far from home that the sky hasn't stopped remembering it. They haunt not to scare, but to be known, to be counted, to be more than statistics or curriculum or marble plaques. They want to be held, in memory, in voice, in letters that may never be read, because to be remembered is to be alive in some small, stubborn way. And the war, for all its noise, left behind a silence that only memory can break. There are places where the wind feels older, not colder, just different, like it's learnt to move slowly, carefully, as though it's brushing over something it can't quite forget. You'll find it in certain fields at dusk, when the sky turns the color of bruised lavender and the hedges stretch long shadows across what used to be no man's land. It's not dramatic, no thunder, no howling, just a hush, a stillness that isn't still, a quiet that presses gently against the back of your neck. People say it's just weather, that fields remember nothing, that mud has no memory, but those people don't stop and listen, because sometimes the wind changes direction for no reason. Sometimes it carries scents, gunpowder, wet wool, a sharp tense like metal. Sometimes it sounds like breathing. Once, a man stood alone near the remains of a trench. He wasn't religious, wasn't sentimental, but when the breeze moved past him, low, slow, steady, he whispered, "I'm sorry," without knowing why, and the air, for a moment, felt warmer. There are stories like that, quiet ones, of schoolchildren who stopped talking mid-tour, eyes wide, not scared, just aware, of dogs who refuse to walk certain paths, of cameras that won't work until they're moved 10 feet left. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe the wind remembers because the people forgot, because somewhere beneath the root systems and clay, beneath the layers of time and polite forgetting, the land is still trying to speak, not in rage, not in grief, just presence, just the steady insistence that something happened here, something vast, something sacred, something terrible. And maybe it's not about haunting, maybe it's about being held by air, by grass, by the hush that lingers long after footsteps have gone. So next time the wind brushes your face in a field like that, don't rush, don't turn away. Pause. It might be nothing, or it might be everything. Not much is left, not in the usual sense. The trenches are shallow scars, the uniforms moth-bitten, the helmets dulled to a color that doesn't quite say metal anymore. Even the stories have softened, smoothed out by time, by retelling, by silence passed down through generations like brittle heirlooms. But some things, quiet things, remain. A whistle, rusted shut, found in a box labeled Dad's Things. No one dares throw it out. A pair of boots, size too small to have belonged to anyone alive now, but too worn to be a replica. A diary 3 pages long. Entries ending mid-sentence. One just reads, "Cold, still waiting." That's what remains, in the end. Not the grand, not the loud, but the incomplete. The questions without answers. The names without stories. The echoes without source. And yet, the stillness, that strange, heavy quiet that settles over these places, it holds. It holds the shape of someone who once sat here, smoking a cigarette, wondering if he'd be warm again. It holds the weight of a letter never finished. The hesitation before an order was followed. The half-step into no man's land cut short. It holds space for the ungrieved, for the unnamed, for the lives that didn't get endings, just interruptions. And in that stillness, there's something like peace, not comfort, not relief, but presence. A breath that stretches across time, settling gently in the chest of anyone who's quiet long enough to hear it. You don't need to understand the war. No one ever did. But you can sit with it, acknowledge it. Let it remind you that even silence is crowded sometimes, with memory, with longing, with truths too old for words. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the landscape asks of us. Not pity, not awe, just attention, just stillness. just to be remembered by someone who came looking. It was quiet, not just a pause, but a stillness so deep it felt like the world had forgotten to breathe. November the 11th, 1918. The guns had talked for 4 long years. Their voices thundered across fields, villages, hearts, and now, suddenly, they stopped. Soldiers didn't cheer at first. They stood in the mud, listening for a sound that never came. The war was over, but the war was still here, in every ache, every scar, every memory that refused to fade. Some men wept, some whispered prayers they'd forgotten. Some just stared at the sky, blue and clear, like it was a stranger they didn't recognize. It was the last whisper of a nightmare, the moment between war and whatever comes next, and the world tried to move forward. But the shadows lingered, because when you've known the trenches, the rats, the mud that swallows feet, and the gas that burns lungs from the inside, quiet is not peace. It's something else, a breath held too long, a memory that will never quite let go. The silence after the guns fell was heavier than the noise. Men who had survived battles that shredded their bodies and souls now faced a different enemy, the quiet. No orders shouted, no explosions ripping through the night, no shells tearing up the earth beneath their feet. Just silence, thick, unforgiving. Some tried to fill it with conversation, with laughter, with the clatter of utensils in crowded mess halls. But the silence slipped through cracks, finding places where words couldn't reach. It wrapped itself around shoulders, pressed into ears, made eyes well up at the sight of a child playing in a garden or a dog chasing a stick. The silence was full of ghosts. Ghosts of friends who never came home. Ghosts of promises broken in mud. Ghosts of dreams snatched too soon. It reminded men that war doesn't end when the treaty is signed. It lives in the spaces between the moments, in the half-forgotten nightmares, in the sudden pain in a leg long healed. And sometimes it whispers, in a voice so soft you almost don't hear it. Remember, remember, remember. The world moved on, built monuments, held ceremonies, but for those who carried the trenches inside them, the silence was the real monument. A reminder that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of memory, the weight of survival, the quiet that holds all the things left unsaid. After the fighting stopped, the letters didn't. They came late. Some written in mud-streaked ink, some in neat handwriting that betrayed the writer's trembling hand. They were sent home, not always delivered, not always read. Some were never meant to leave the trenches. Folded in the breast pocket of a coat, pressed against the heart like a talisman, they were confessions, promises, dreams. Tell my mother I thought of her every day. I'm sorry I never wrote more. I hope to see the sun again soon. But the letters also carried fear, a quiet terror no one dared speak aloud. The fear of silence, the fear of forgetting, the fear that the war was not over, that it would find them again. Families waited, some for years, for news, for a sign, for the chance to say goodbye. Others received news in waves, both joy and sorrow tangled like barbed wire. These letters became the last link, the final conversation, the echo of a voice no longer there. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, a letter would be read again. Words spoken softly into the dark, a memory carried by the wind. Because in the end, the war was not just fought in trenches or fields. It was fought in hearts. And those hearts still speak, through paper, through silence, through the last whisper of a letter carried home. Faces appeared in the mist. Not the faces of generals or kings, but the faces of the boys, the ones who never made it out. Their eyes wide with wonder or terror or something between, seemed to peer from the fog that clung to the fields at dawn. Sometimes a silhouette would linger near an old oak, a laugh too soft to place, a whisper lost before it could be heard. Locals spoke of these moments quietly. No one mocked. No one rushed in with explanations, because some things are too large to deny, too small to prove. The war didn't leave the land. It planted itself, root and bone deep. And though years have passed, though cities have grown, though generations have come and gone, the ghosts remain, not as terrors, not as curses, but as memories, as reminders that these fields were once alive with dreams, that those boys had stories beyond the trenches, that their lives mattered. And maybe that's the last whisper of the war, not the sound of guns, but the echo of faces in the fog, waiting. The war ended, but the promise lingered, a promise to remember, to hold close the stories that never found their way into history books, to carry the weight of silence with care. Some vowed never to forget, others tried and failed, but the promise is kept in small ways, in poppies worn on lapels, in ceremonies held at dusk, in moments of silence shared across crowded rooms. It lives in poems read aloud on rainy afternoons, in letters passed from hand to hand, in the slow unfolding of truth over generations. The trenches may have been filled, the guns silenced, the soldiers gone, but the war's shadow remains, not to haunt, but to remind that even in the darkest mud there was light. Even among the rats and rot there was laughter. Even beneath the gas and the grief there was love. And so, as the world moves forward and the noise of life grows louder, there is a quiet promise, whispered softly by those who walked the trenches to remember, to honor, to carry the last whisper into the dawn. Thank you for staying with me. The story isn't over, but for now we rest. Thank you for watching and sharing this quiet journey through the trenches with me. I hope these stories have found a place in your heart tonight, bringing a little comfort or a gentle thought before sleep. If you enjoyed this time together, please consider subscribing, not because I need the numbers, but because I'd love to keep sharing these whispered histories with you. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is, may your night be peaceful and kind. Good night, and take care.